Hello everybody, today an important discussion about one of the big questions of our age and something that is going to dictate the future of our entire planet. This is something that I think, wrongly handled, could become one of the biggest scandals of the 21st century. I am of course talking about electric cars, or if you prefer, EVs. Now, one important thing to get out of the way immediately is the fact that I really like EVs. Every time I get the chance to drive one, I do find something that I enjoy about it, and I certainly welcome a future where EVs are an important part of our transport infrastructure. However, there are a number of things that have happened in the last couple of years, and indeed in the last few months, that I think prompt a revisit to this topic, which I know myself and many others have covered in great detail before. The reality is that socially and politically, we're in a situation that I don't think anybody saw coming. Though the technology behind EVs continues to improve and I welcome development of it, I think trying to push everybody down the same path is a terrible mistake. Though, like I said, myself and many others have covered this topic a number of times before, there are three key reasons why I believe now is the right time to revisit it. First off, much of the data and numbers that I see supporting the transition towards EVs is based on people doing things the right and sensible way. And let's be honest here, people don't really do things the right and sensible way. Secondly, a lot of the discussion surrounding EVs is still using this ICE mentality, ICE being combustion engine cars. And the fact is, the two actually work in a very, very different way. They are fundamentally not the same thing. You can't treat them the same way. They each have strengths and weaknesses, and to try and see one as equivalent to the other, I think is a great mistake, and the reason behind a lot of people failing to understand the benefits of EVs as much as the drawbacks. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, society has changed. Across the globe, people now do things a little bit differently, and this includes the way that they see transport. And this has a big impact because many of the numbers and studies on the benefits of EVs were done based on data from a few years ago. And the fact is, the way that we treat all cars is different now, and this has a particular impact on the benefit of an electric car. In other words, for many people, I now believe that benefit has disappeared entirely, and in actual fact, the right solution, both for them and the planet, actually isn't an EV at all. It may not even be a hybrid. So today, I'm going to be discussing the four key issues surrounding transport as far as I see it, and the reasons why EV may not necessarily be the answer. Those are pollution, congestion, safety, and money. So, without further ado, let's get the funky music playing, and I'll see you the other side. A huge thank you to today's headline sponsor, CarVertical, the super-powered super search that cross-references a number of databases across the globe to give you all the information you need to have when coming to buy a used car, including information on mileage and verification, accident history regardless of whether the car was written off, use as a taxi, and even handy hints and tips and well-known weaknesses of particular models. CarVertical is also now available on mobile, where you'll get the same easy-to-read yet detailed reports, just pocket-sized. For a special discount, check out my link in the description down below. Now then, on to point number one, and this really is the big one, so let's get it out the way first. Pollution. Like I said at the start, and this is going to be a theme throughout this video, I fully believe EVs to be a part of the solution, but simply not the complete solution. To be perfectly honest, this really is the case for just about any big decision in life. In fact, an analogy that I often like to use is, imagine you've got 100 people to dinner, and you have to feed all of them the exact same thing. The same starter, main, and dessert. And you realise very quickly, by the time you've got to about the 6th person, that's simply not possible because Jesse doesn't like pork, Brian doesn't like beef, John is a celiac, Joan is a vegetarian, Jerry is kosher, Brian is halal, and Pete, well, Pete's just difficult. So you can't feed 100 people the same thing. Chances are you might actually kill one of them. So when it comes to talking about millions of people or billions of people across the globe, thinking that there's one way forward for everyone is just daft, if not, well, arrogant. The first thing on my hit list is the term zero emissions. I hate it with a passion because it's simply not true. If you really want things to be zero emissions, think very carefully because you are not zero emissions. You expel CO2. Can't really get around that, and I'm pretty sure that you want to continue emitting CO2 for as long as you possibly can, so instead the way to deal with things really is to find out a way to offset that. I've discussed this in great detail in other videos, and I'm not really going to go down that path too much today. Instead, I think this terminology is just downright unhelpful because it makes people believe that an electric car in of itself will reduce overall CO2. And that just isn't the case. The term I would like to see adopted is zero local emissions, because that's actually more accurate. That's the term that Toyota used to describe the Mirai, their hydrogen car, because yes, it does technically use a fuel, hydrogen, but what comes out the back is water. No harmful emissions of any kind. So in practical terms, that's just as good for the environment it's in as an EV. And this is crucial. You see, there are a lot of places where I think EVs actually are the right solution, including particularly urban centres like London, because London has a big air quality problem. This is something we cannot afford to ignore. Yes, things have been done over the years to address it, but ultimately it is still an issue. It does irk me greatly that very often you'll see actually a lot of public transport is made up of nasty old diesel vehicles spewing all sorts of black gump out the back, and you are told if you want to drive the same place as them, you've got to bring something nice, clean, shiny and new. That doesn't seem very fair, does it? But actually, pushing the whole emissions thing to a side for a second, an EV is actually the perfect thing to drive around a city centre. They're quiet, they're talky, they're responsive, don't have to wait for a turbo to spool up if you want to quickly nip into a gap in traffic. They're also very pleasant things. They do their best range in urban environments. This is where you need to charge them the least. They're actually quite nice things. Also, many places around the world now have incentives so that if you are driving a low or no emissions vehicle, you'll pay very little or nothing in terms of congestion charges, emissions fees and all that stuff, so there are some real world savings to be had. Additionally, if you are driving around an urban environment, you're not actually going to be doing that much in terms of mileage, so you can have a car with a smaller battery, smaller motor, and that means that a lower powered charging point is going to actually do more. It's going to be more effective. Plugging in an e-up is going to give you a lot more over 10 hours on a 13 amp socket than it would an RS e-tron. That's simple maths, that makes the car cheaper, and this is going to be key for one of our points later on. However, don't think that this means that overall EVs are actually that much better for the planet, because the fact is they're not. Though they may be an improvement is what they are. They're simply not a fix. There's a great document published by Polestar in 2020 that is publicly accessible, in which they do a fairly comprehensive job of comparing a Volvo XC40 with a combustion engine, though they helpfully don't tell you exactly which one, and a variety of Polestar 2 configurations. A side note, in recent times they say they have improved the production process and reduced the CO2 involved, so the numbers here aren't quite up to date, but the difference isn't big enough to really seem worth worrying about. In this document, they compare these two different cars and then give you figures for the car's CO2 emissions over its total life. This includes manufacture, driving, and then end-of-life process. I think it's very good. It goes into a lot of detail, and if you're interested in this topic, is well worth a read. The numbers, though, may shock you a little bit, because in this document, if you take the numbers that Polestar themselves provide, remember, they are a company making now exclusively electric cars, and if you look at the figures for an XC40 with a combustion engine, compared with the long-range dual-motor version of a Polestar 2, this is the least favourable comparison for the EV, by the way, the car with the biggest battery pack and the most motors. And then you assume that this car has been fed with what they deem to be the global average electricity mix. So that's the mix of water, wind, air, solar, coal, nuclear, etc., etc. But the global average mix. Over that car's life, the CO2 savings will be about 15%. Which doesn't sound great, does it? In fact, if you were to swap a 2009 Ford Focus Zetec with the 1.6 litre engine for the modern day 1 litre EcoBoost equivalent, your savings would actually be closer to 20 to 30% per mile driven. That's not overall, it's not exactly the same apples for apples comparison, but per mile driven, you'd actually have a fairly significant saving. Things do get better, of course, if you were to go and buy, say, a Polestar 2 with the single motor and the standard range battery, and then feed the car using only wind power. But even in that scenario, your saving is going to be somewhere between 50 and 60%. Remember earlier I said I hate the idea of zero emissions? This is why, because even if you do make the transition to an EV, you haven't eliminated CO2 from your car, you've simply reduced it between 15 and say 50%, which is great, but it's not much. Really annoyingly, if you were to say move from the Volvo XC40 to a Polestar 2 long-range dual motor, and then you fed it only using wind power, more or less the cleanest that you can find, your savings would be fairly significant. In fact, you'd save about 31 tons of CO2 over the lifetime of the car, which is about the same as a 747 will emit in an hour of flight. So get on a plane and you've more or less gone a long way to offsetting what it is you've saved by changing to an electric car. If you want to know more about this stuff, I did a whole video on CO2. Like I said, don't take too many of these numbers for gospel because they're constantly changing. This is one of the big problems. Technology is evolving for both EVs and combustion engine cars too. But the bigger problem for me is this philosophical one. You see, all of the maths here is done on a car which has a life of, they say, 200,000 kilometers, 124,000 miles. In some markets, I'm sure that would be considered quite low mileage for a car to be at end of life, in America particularly. However, here, I wouldn't say that's so inaccurate. In fact, this is the source of the problem, because if you were to go on Auto Trader today, you would find 434,000 cars for sale. Let's ignore a great number of them and look only at the ones 10 years old and older. So if we set 2012 as the latest date of registration, on account of this piece being filmed in 2022, we now have just 78,000, just over, cars for sale. Of those, how many have actually done more than the 124,000 miles that Polestar considered to be an end-of-life thing? Well, actually, relatively few. In fact, only about 10%. So if you were to take cars up to 125,000 miles, you're still left with 69,500 of the 78. More worryingly, reduce that to 100,000 miles, there are still 55,000 cars left for sale, and reduce it to 70,000 miles, there are still 27,000 for sale, which is about a third of the total cars over 10 years old currently for sale on Auto Trader. The reason I chose the 70,000 mile mark is, worst case scenario granted, that is the crossover point when Polestar believe that a car, an EV, is going to be better on CO2 than the equivalent combustion engine vehicle. I'm sure this isn't quite fair. The reality is maybe a lot lower, particularly as I'm now looking at older cars. But the point I'm trying to make here is that a large number of cars are getting to a certain age without having actually done the mileage required to have offset the CO2 were it an EV instead. And here is where I bring in another one of those points early on. Remember when I said people don't really act in a sensible or logical way? I see an awful lot of scaremongering on the internet about EVs with old battery packs. Oh, they get to 10 years old, they're just useless. It's going to cost you £5 billion to put a new battery in a Tesla. Oh, my mobile phone's 6 months old and the battery's already gone, and electric car's obviously going to be the same. A lot of this is just complete and total twaddle. It's absolute nonsense, needless scaremongering. But scaremongering works. We have more or less fixed the problems that diesels had. A current modern day diesel is a clean, efficient thing as they were supposed to be 10 years ago. How many people do you know want to buy a diesel? Yeah, exactly. So it's the same thing with EVs. If people believe they don't really last past 10 years, they're not going to buy them past 10 years, which creates a lot of other problems we'll get onto soon. Most critically though, in terms of pollution, if the car doesn't last long enough to do the mileage, then, well, it's not really doing its job, is it? It's not saving the planet. And this is the other issue. Cars that are going to be in a city aren't going to do many miles, because you can't really do 10,000 miles a year just driving around London unless you're a taxi or a delivery driver. For everybody else, an EV presently may not be the right choice, and the simple fact is, if the cars are being binned at 50, 60, 70,000 miles, they've actually been worse overall for CO2. An awful lot of people have now switched to work from home, meaning they no longer commute. These are people that have seen their mileage drop dramatically. A large number of cars are also on a PCP or other finance agreement, which often comes with a mileage limitation. Typically that used to be around 10,000 miles, but now I see it more common for that to be 5,000 or 6,000 because the cars are simply being used less. I know the instant reaction of many people would be to say, oh, but just use public transport if you're not driving the car. Well, for a great number of people all across the world, and even here in Great Britain, public transport simply isn't an option. My local village has got a good few number of houses in it, probably 100 to 200. There is no bus. Well, there is apparently, but you have to call it in advance, and then if someone else doesn't also want the bus, it just won't turn up. That's pointless, isn't it? Everybody in this village has at least one car. Many households have 2, 3, or maybe even 4, because they need them. I have also in recent times seen an increasing number of articles which suggest that the current boogeyman is not actually CO2 or other emissions anymore. Instead, it's things like particulates from tyres and brakes. EVs, I think, largely have the brake thing under control because many of them use regenerative braking, so that's not actually much of an issue. But your equivalent EV is almost always heavier than a combustion engine vehicle, and for that reason they'll be much harder on their tyres and surely degrade them faster, creating a lot more pollution. This is to say nothing of the people that have a Tesla and at every available opportunity put it in ludicrous mode and boot it. Those will go through tyres very quickly. And it would seem as if now that's actually a much bigger problem than what used to come out of your tailpipe. Point number 2. Remember how I just told you that London is the perfect place for an EV? Well, this is where it gets a little bit complicated because point number 2 is congestion. We are suffering a lot of it, and it doesn't really appear to be getting any better. And I think a large part of the problem is actually EVs and also people. Remember I said that they don't make a lot of sense? Well, if you've been to just about any city in Britain or probably anywhere else in the world, particularly America, you will notice that it's full of a lot of people driving great big 7-seat V8 powered behemoths with one very small 5-foot petite woman or man in the front. And this clearly is quite stupid. What you actually should have for driving around an urban environment is something small, lightweight, compact, easy to park, easy to nip out into traffic and all that. But people don't seem so keen on that. The fact is that if you live, work and drive chiefly inside the M25, something like a VW Up or the Honda E, which only has a range of just over 100 miles, far less than 200, is actually more than adequate. As mentioned previously, 100 miles of driving in London is actually quite a bit, so you've then eliminated the need to charge daily, which gets you around a few issues, including the fact that though London seems like the perfect place to own an EV, it is in fact the worst place to own an EV, because out here in the countryside, just about everyone, in fact, everyone in my road, barring about 2, have their own driveway, and those actually have a dedicated parking space around the back of the house. So we can all charge our cars at home. In London, there are entire streets where nobody has access to any parking. In fact, a large number of people in Great Britain do not have dedicated parking at their house, and I would wager a large portion of the people that don't are in urban areas. So those who need the EV the most also will have the hardest time owning it, because those are people that won't be able to charge at home, taking advantage of their cheap rate home electricity. Not that it's cheap rate, we'll get onto that in a bit. And so they'll be stuck with trying to charge it publicly, which is an inconvenience, particularly if it's a slow charging point and there are time restrictions, as there will certainly be in London. If you've ever tried to park in London, even if you're only just into it, it's a nightmare. Charging isn't any better, there aren't enough charging points, and the ones that do exist will want to charge you a lot of money. So it's also not going to be a particularly enticing thing. Again, we'll get onto that a little bit. This is one of the exciting and also frustrating things about doing videos like this. All of the topics and points are somewhat intertwined into this sort of wonderful discussion spaghetti. Anyway, getting back on track. The issue, and the reason that I say congestion is a problem for EVs, is that, yeah, sure, a VW e-up more than capable for living, driving, working in London. But people see a range of 100, 150 miles and they go, oh, but what if I want to drive to Scotland? Now, they don't drive to Scotland on a regular basis. Some people do. My other half's family do. They live in London and they live in Scotland. They commute between the two. So the car that has to work in London also has to be a car that can go to Scotland. And as they don't fancy stopping 5 times to charge a Honda E, and they do need to take stuff with them when they go, they need a large car. And for an EV to have a long range, it needs a very large battery pack, which means it's big, which means it's heavy, which means it needs bigger motors, which means it needs a bigger battery pack, so on and so forth. The exact opposite of Gordon Murray's cycle of lightness. And that's how you find yourself in this situation where everyone is still driving around great big massive 4x4s that are supposed to save the planet, but in actual fact really aren't, because while there are still combustion engine vehicles about, all you're doing is contributing to the congestion problem. As, believe it or not, I don't like to be the person that just moans about something instead of presenting a solution, I'd like to offer one. I suggest we take a leaf out of the Japanese playbook and introduce here a category of car I'm going to call the new K car, because to me this would make a lot of sense. And really a car in that category should be something, let's say VW Lupo sized, Nissan Micra, that sort of thing. A small car, maybe 3.5 to 3.7 meters in length, reasonably narrow, with either an electric power plant, hybrid if you so desire, or pure petrol, which I actually think would make a lot of sense for packaging and other reasons. Limit the weight of said vehicle to 1 ton, maybe a little bit more for a full EV. Limit the emissions, limit the power to say 100 horses, and to be fair, 100 horsepower in an 800-900 kilo car, you can still have something pretty fun. Look at say the VW Up GTI, that's kind of there or thereabouts. And if you do that, you bring along with it a series of regulations and rules. Say those are cars which maybe have less VAT on, so they're cheaper to buy. Those are cars which are all congestion exempt, because if you think about it for a moment, why is it that a brand new £150,000 long wheelbase Range Rover is exempt from the congestion charge and an old Micra isn't? That doesn't make any sense, does it? Because if you're actually trying to improve congestion, then you should let small cars through for free and penalise big cars, regardless of how new or old they are. Likewise, if you're trying to reduce pollution, then yeah, sure, charge the older, more polluting car and don't charge the new, slightly cleaner one. But don't say you're trying to fix congestion when actually that's not what you're doing. With EVs now being so common and popular, I think the introduction of a new class with some real fiscal benefits can actually be a great thing, and I think will help both consumers and also the public, because it will reduce congestion and encourage, I think, a more helpful type of vehicle, the sort of thing that actually will make a difference, because honestly, in London, a Tesla Model S isn't helping anything. Though I will say for Tesla's benefit, they haven't really ever plugged their cars as a way to save the planet. It's one of the things that I like about the company. Third, and this is a really controversial one, yeah, as if the last two haven't been, safety. We've all seen those videos of a Tesla going up like an iPhone. We know the dangers of lithium batteries if they're pierced. There's a good reason that airlines don't want to carry any of them. This caused me a lot of issues in my previous life. However, I'm not really overall that worried about an EV catching fire. I've never sat in one and thought, oh blimey, this is a bit dangerous because I'm sat on a huge battery. I know that cars today face far more numerous and stricter crash safety tests than they ever have. However, this doesn't mean that when things do go wrong, they don't go wrong in a rather spectacular way. I do feel for the makers of EVs because it often seems like the internet has it in for them, says the man making a video on why you shouldn't be buying one. But I think a lot of times things are misreported. Say with the Tesla autopilot system, if it does have a crash, you will hear about it, but if a normal ordinary bloke gets tanked up and crashes his car in Georgia into a tree, I'm not going to hear about it. But if a Tesla catches fire, I will. Same, I suppose, for a Nissan Leaf, a Kia, etc, etc, etc. I'm using Tesla here because this seems to be what people associate with the electric car. And, let's be honest here, for the last 100 years, we have been perfectly content with pouring some very, very flammable and nasty stuff into our cars. No trouble whatsoever. I found it quite amusing that when I finally did cover a hydrogen vehicle, people were quick to point out how horrible and nasty hydrogen is if it goes up. And it's not as if Toyota haven't considered that and thought of that when they designed it. Same for all of these vehicles, be they electric, hybrid, petrol, diesel, whatever. It doesn't really matter. There's also a bunch of other stuff related to safety that honestly is just internet nonsense, including the fact that some scrote could just come up and disconnect the car. Anyone that's actually owned or simply used for a bit an EV will know that disconnecting the thing isn't the easiest, even when it's your car, you have the key and everything else. You want to take a saw to a cable that potentially has 350 kilowatt of electricity running through it? You know what? I'm in favour of letting nature take its course. Good luck to you. The reality is that I suspect people have seen this coming, they've foreseen damage perhaps happening to these cables, and so they will make sure that if they were sliced, nobody would actually be hurt. However, I foresee a scenario in not too long when there is going to be an accident that is going to catch the public's eye. I spoke with someone recently who works for a firm where they convert old cars to electric. And he said that the company's advice was, once you see smoke from a vehicle, you have potentially just 10 seconds to get out of it. So can you imagine the headline now? EV catches fire, driver gets out, but disabled granny in the back burns to death. Horrible, isn't it? Something I've actually thought about recently, having to transport elderly and frail family members about who certainly can't spring out of the car like a racing driver on their ARDS test. These are people that need, even with help, 30, 40, 50, 60 seconds to get out of a car. And if that's the time they've got left, yeah, that's not so good. That's a headline that puts people off buying cars. This is to say nothing of the more practical and likely danger of people just crashing the damn things. All of us know a pensioner that has just got into a car, usually an automatic, put their foot down on the wrong pedal, and then gone and done something really, really stupid. With EVs having no real gears to speak of and being considerably quicker, even like for like, than their old petrol or diesel counterparts, the potential for crashes to get even nastier is even higher. And then I walk through places in London where you get people in their RS6s or their Range Rovers who are keen to rev up their engine, and even when they've only got, 10, 15 yards to go, will give the thing the absolute big one and try and impress everybody. Imagine someone doing that. I actually experienced something very much like this a few months ago. I was driving down a country lane and approaching a junction where I intended to turn left. There was a chap in a Tesla Model S then waiting to turn right, so essentially we were sort of doing that kind of thing. As he pulled out the junction, he put his foot down. The car gripped and then came onto my side of the road. Luckily, he then turned and avoided a collision, but it was pretty scary. He obviously didn't have any clue as to how much power and grip that car had, and when he came out of that bend, he just almost did a U-turn. This is something I think we're going to see a lot more frequently. Yeah, sure, these cars now have a lot more safety systems in them designed to stop this kind of thing happening, but none of them are entirely foolproof, as we've seen, and none of them will help you if you've turned them off, as people I think are likely to do, especially those that want to impress their mates by spinning wheels and doing all sorts of crazy things. And this discussion very neatly takes us into point number 4, which is then cost, because if people get this idea that EVs are in some way unsafe or they don't last longer than 10 years, they're not going to be worth anything after 10 years. And as most people are buying them on finance, monthly payments will be high if depreciation is equally high. Currently, EVs are experiencing a bit of a honeymoon period, as to be fair is most of the rest of the motoring trade, because the market is a little bit odd. This is not a situation that's going to carry on forever. EVs will soon start to be experiencing their own depreciation curves. In fact, for older ones like the Leaf, some early Teslas and so on, it's already happened. Look at basic versions of those that don't have big range, have now older battery packs. People really don't want them. They're almost as much of a pariah as an old diesel. And at the end of the day, EVs are just really blooming expensive. Point number 4. Like I said at the very beginning, I welcome EVs as a part of our transport future. I believe they have a very important place to take, and there are many people for whom, even now, they are the right choice. But anybody trying to tell me that they are the cheaper alternative, I think is going to struggle. The weird thing is that I have been driving EVs now for about 5 or 6 years, and in that time, though the EV network has dramatically improved, there are a lot more charging points, a lot faster charging points, more fast charging points and so on, things also have gotten a lot more expensive. 4 or 5 years ago, generally speaking, when I took a car out, I would try and find free chargers, and there were plenty of those. The ones that wanted to charge you would be about 12 pence a kilowatt hour, and the really expensive ones at motorways were about 35. Fast forward to 2022, and I find the cheaper points are more along the lines of sort of 25 to 35 pence a kilowatt hour, your more average ones, say 45 to 55, and your expensive motorway ones, 60 to 70p. At the top end, that can often mean that charging an EV costs you very similar to charging a great variety of combustion engine cars, which may have cost a lot less to buy in the first place. EV fanboys and girls will no doubt already be sharpening their keyboards to tell me I'm doing it wrong, to tell me that every time I go to a fast charging point I am being an absolute moron. Well, the fact is, if I've got 400 miles to drive in a day, as I often do in the job that I have, I don't really have much choice. I don't fancy waiting 7 hours to charge a car. I really don't want to wait an hour, but if I have to, I will. I didn't mind it so much when I waited an hour to charge the car, but I could then get to Scotland for £8. But the last time I had an EV, it cost me about £50 to do 200 miles. And that was in one that actually wasn't that inefficient. EVs do also have efficiencies. This is something I think the market is still coming to terms with and struggling to understand because the metrics used are all over the shop. There is no consistency whatsoever. You say to someone how economical is your car, they go, oh, I do 25 to the gallon on a run, or 35 to the gallon, or I get 70 to the gallon or something. People just know. With EVs, different manufacturers use different methods and they're all somewhat difficult to comprehend, especially if you're trying to work out which car to buy. The one I prefer, because it's the one that makes most sense, is miles per kilowatt hour. A good car is going to do about, say, 4, maybe a little bit over. A really bad one, 2 or just under. So that's a doubling or a halving. So that's quite significant. The Audi e-tron, the worst I've had, that did about 1.8 to 2. Teslas are very good. Some of the Kias, they're over 4. They're really quite efficient. The Audi RS e-tron I had, that was sort of 3.5 to 3, thereabouts. So that was okay. But this makes a big difference when you're charging a vehicle. And if you've got a car with a big battery pack, charging from a 13 amp socket, a little 3-pin classic home plug, that's not really going to do that much. The e-tron took over 24 hours to charge. Obviously, if you're on a long journey, you can't do that. You have to go to fast charging points. If you own these cars, you will get discount cards sometimes, but as a journalist, I don't get them. This, I think, is also actually quite key, because again, people might say, well, you're an idiot. If you really own one of these cars, you'd get this discounted rate. Yeah, only if you remember your card. But could you imagine a world where you went to go to fill up at Shell or Tesco or BPRS or wherever, and normally it'd cost you, say, £100, but you forgot your Shell loyalty card. You didn't bring your Tesco club card. Now it's £300. That might sound ridiculous. That might sound like an exaggeration, but actually for some charging points, that's not actually that far off. Your discount can be half, and even then, they're still not the cheapest cars to run. In fact, the only way that you would see your money back is by doing well over 100,000 miles in these vehicles. Ignore the CO2 thing for a minute. If you just want to see a cost saving, that's going to take a long time. And as most people will have these cars on a finance agreement of some kind that limits the mileage that they can do, there is no way. There is absolutely no way you will ever see a cost saving in an EV over the time you're likely to own it and drive it. The biggest issue for me, which I kind of alluded to earlier, is that if you are someone whose circumstances have changed, now you're working from home, your mileage driven per year has dramatically reduced. Say you used to do 10,000 miles a year, now you do 6,000 miles a year because they're now mostly personal miles. You go into the office once a week rather than 5 times. Well, the saving you've just had, both from a financial and also environmental perspective, is much bigger than the one you'd get by buying a new EV. If you want to really save the planet and you're doing very few miles, just buy a cheap, economical, small combustion engine car that already exists, or an older EV, an early generation Kia Soul EV. They're actually still quite decent cars, particularly if you're not fussed about performance. They're very decent things. They'll keep going. As it happens, Kia do deserve special mention, because this morning I read an article from Which, from earlier in the year, where they said that full EVs are the cars most prone to breakdown, and also, when they break down, are also off the road the longest. So, they estimate that something like a third of EVs do suffer a problem in the first 4 years, compared to just under a fifth for regular combustion engine cars. And when the cars are off the road, they're off the road on average just under twice as long as a regular car. In fact, of all the vehicle types surveyed, it was pure petrol combustion cars which turned out to be the most reliable. They were, generally speaking, hard to kind of equate these things, twice as reliable as a full EV. The exception being Kia, whose e-Niro was actually regarded as one of the most reliable in all segments, not just pure EV. Well done, Kia. Thank you for making a decent, reliable car. These are things that really are going to take some time to adjust to, and when it comes to a lot of these facts and figures, the truth is there just aren't enough cars out there, or there aren't enough cars that have been out there for long enough to try and draw real parallels between the new EV stuff and the older combustion engine stuff. And of course, combustion engine technology has also moved along. It hasn't simply stayed still. It's not the same as it was even 15 years ago. It's very, very different. It has improved in its own ways. This is why I say I think each person needs to find the car, the solution that works for them. Look at the whole picture. Don't just go, oh, that car's zero emissions. Go and buy it and then drive it 1,000 miles a year, because you've actually done worse for the planet. Much worse than if you just bought a small petrol-powered car. On a very basic level, the price of EVs also seems to be going up. In reality, I think the actual cost of production is likely going down, thanks to the fact that the technology is maturing. But there's still a huge amount of R&D being thrown at these cars. Companies need to pay for that somehow. They need to turn their entire model ranges into EV because they've been told they don't have any choice. And to me, that's just nonsensical. The Fiat 500 electric that I drove cost over £30,000. It's a Fiat 500, for crying out loud, and it didn't really, in terms of interior fit, finish or materials, feel any different to the normal 500. That's half the price. It's madness. These are expensive cars. The people in society that need the help most are the ones that are going to suffer the greatest. The grant for EVs is going and gone depending on where you are. It isn't even as much as it used to be anyway, if you can still get it. And this has put, for many people, the real cost of buying one of these cars up. The fact that currently they're refusing to depreciate, cars are hard to get and everything, I think is incidental and cannot be blamed on the EV themselves or the manufacturers. That's just the market that we're in. But at a slightly more complex level, we've also seen fluctuating prices for both combustion engine fuel and also electricity too. Fans on both sides are arguing with each other. But here's my theory. The fact is, I think electricity ultimately will win out. The great thing about an EV is that it doesn't really care where its electricity has come from. Though earlier I mentioned that depending on how you power your car, your overall CO2 is going to be very different, the car doesn't drive any different. It's not like putting diesel in a car, or putting super diesel in, or putting E5, E10 or race fuel in. There is really no difference. As far as your car is concerned, electricity is electricity, regardless of whether it's come from wind or from a coal-fired power station. This is good news because it means as renewable technology improves and becomes more commonplace, your cars are inherently going to become cleaner, even the old ones. The same logic still applies that you do need to do a certain number of miles, and I think in the short term, we're not going to see people going to 100% wind electricity. It's just not going to happen fast enough. As far as I'm concerned, the obvious thing to be doing is to be building loads of nuclear power stations because they're largely unaffected by events abroad, where the price of fuel, if you import it, can be by world events, as can be the price of electric vehicles. One of the big issues they face, that I think a lot of people are afraid to mention, is the fact that currently, and hopefully this will improve, many of the materials in an EV, particularly in the battery, are sourced from countries that don't always have the greatest reputation. I'm not just talking about human rights records and things like that. That's a whole different topic I'm not going to get into. I'm instead talking about the fact that these are countries that have in the past suddenly decided, you know what, we need that stuff. We don't want to export it. So if they decide to do that, there's not really anything that we can do. And if we've moved ourselves into this area where we're entirely dependent on one type of vehicle, and 90% of these get 90% of their components for their battery, or 90% of one vital component from a country that then decides they don't want to sell it anymore, we're stuffed. In anything really, diversity is really key to longevity. Having a variety of different fuel types on the road is really quite helpful. I'm sure there are people out there that in the last year we've had storms, we've had fuel shortages. Maybe you've got an EV and you've got a combustion engine vehicle. And I'm sure there have been times where you've gone, whew, thank goodness for that EV. There's no petrol at the station, but I can charge my car anywhere I like. And I'm sure there have also been a few times where you've gone, oof, thank goodness for that petrol car, because I've got a can of it, which means I'm good for about 300 or 400 miles because I cannot charge my EV. I lost the electricity here for 4 days earlier in the year. Longest it's ever happened for, but that was crazy. And if I was here with an EV that had very little charge in it, yeah, that would have been annoying. As it happened, I did have an EV when the petrol had run out, so I was very, very happy and smug when that occurred. However, I am not so silly as to think that electricity is going to carry on getting cheaper, because in the last few months it's done anything but, nor am I foolish enough to think that petrol and diesel prices are going to remain high. Let's be honest about something. Fossil fuel companies are evil. They're also greedy, but they're not stupid. They want to stay in business. I know a lot of people think that soon petrol's going to be 3-4 quid a litre or whatever. Well, if people can't afford that, petrol companies aren't going to put the prices up that high. They have recently, people kept buying stuff, they put it up to 2 quid, people did, they didn't really have much choice, nobody really liked it. Prices have come down quite a bit, and as EVs gain their popularity, I think the big companies are going to be interested in making sure they've still got a product people want to buy. And for them, the easiest way to fight the EV is to make your fossil fuels cheap, or cheap enough that they're still a viable alternative. Economically, if not, environmentally, philosophically, this, that, and the other. It's going to take a long time to transition. It took a long time for people to transition from leaded to unleaded. So to transition from fuel to EV, I think is something that governments shouldn't set a date on. We shouldn't force it. We should encourage people into certain solutions. We should encourage companies to develop more environmentally friendly ways of doing things. And we should also be paying attention to the likes of Toyota, who innovated with things like the Prius. No, not the first hybrid to market, but I think the one that really succeeded. And look at them and go, why haven't you been building more fully electric cars? It's not that they don't want to, or that they're afraid to. It's that they've looked at the whole situation and gone, actually, we think really this isn't necessarily the best solution for everybody. We think it's not the thing that works for us. There also is the simple and very basic fact that cost of living is at an all-time high, and I think now is absolutely the worst point in time to try and be punishing people and pushing them into cars which are even more expensive. There are currently loads of people out there driving 15-year-old combustion engine cars who live in London, have to pay the charge every time they go into the centre of town, and they haven't changed their car because they're lazy or because they like their current car, but because they can't afford something else. And we do run the risk of sort of dividing the whole car market into two sections of nice, modern, clean, eco-friendly electric cars, which are expensive, and all the other stuff, which is dirt cheap because nobody really wants it, but also it's going to be really, really expensive to run because it's out-of-date tech and we're trying to be punishing people for it. And that's just wrong. That's just purely and simply wrong. If the government actually wanted to help, they actually wanted to improve things, they bring back the scrappage scheme and they say, you know what? Bring us your old diesels, anything Euro 3, Euro 4 or older, bring us that. And if you want to buy something that's Euro 6 or better or an EV, we'll give you a whole heap of money towards it. But they don't want to, because I don't think they actually care about these things. It's just, to be honest, I don't really even know what they're doing. At the end of the day, I welcome EVs. I think they're brilliant. I think they're amazing to drive. I think they're a really good experience. And I'm impressed at how far they've come in such a short amount of time. This actually also is a bit of a weakness because people won't want to drive old ones, which is going to then lead us back to the beginning of this discussion. But ultimately, I would like to see a future with some common sense in it. You live, work and drive in London, have an EV. You live, work and drive places that have low emission zones, but you're in a commercial capacity, you're a taxi, you're a haulage firm, or you're maybe a construction company and you want low or zero local emission vehicles, but they can't afford to be off the road for hours a day while they're charging. Hydrogen is perfect. Anything with a depot, all buses should be hydrogen because it makes so much sense for that kind of vehicle. Likewise, if you live in the middle of nowhere up in Scotland and you're 50 miles from the local petrol station, having a nice diesel with a big tank and a long range probably makes an awful lot of sense. And if you're somewhere where you've got neighbours that hate you, get an EV because it's nice, quiet, and they'll think more of you. But really, I think you need to look at what you're actually doing with your car, how many miles you're driving it, what your contribution to the environment is actually going to be. And I think 99 times out of 100, I just cannot imagine someone saying, you know what, I've thought of absolutely everything. I've looked at it from all the different angles and I've decided the right thing for me and the planet is a brand new EV. Because unless you're going to keep it for over 70,000 miles, you are not actually saving the planet. Maybe you like the car, in which case fine. Know loads of people that bought EVs and they said, you know what, don't care about the green bit, I just like driving them. Or they're really fast, they're really fun, they're quiet, I like them. Fine. Please, don't pretend that ultimately they're the best thing for everyone. because I don't think they are. Anyway, I'm sure I've upset loads of people, intrigued a few others, and maybe made some people go, that's quite right. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. I look forward to reading it. I'll get my flame suit on. See you for the next one. Bye-bye.